We know climate change is serious, but the world does not seem to have a truly serious attitude toward climate change yet.
If we are really aware of danger of climate change and want to deal with them as a serious problem, we should be able to get climate change issue whenever turning on TV or radio, like a state of war emergency.
In reality, there is a huge gap between the world's perception and action. However, young generation, as a party to live in the future, is acting together to make a change. So,
We act. I'm currently a member of Yuseibers, a youth organization to tackle the climate crisis in Korea. Surprisingly, just a year ago, I had no interest in climate change. So let me tell you a brief story about why I got interested in climate change issues. Last year, I participated in a novel contest about a carbon-neutral future in 2050. In fact, at that time, I hadn't heard about the word carbon neutrality. Therefore, I didn't even understand the meaning of it. To write the novel, I researched and analyzed various sets of data on climate change and carbon neutrality. It was then I came to realize how serious the global climate change is and understand the reason why the world needs to achieve carbon neutrality. While broadening my knowledge, I finished my novel, and luckily, I won the first prize on the contest. It was then the change began. Families, friends, and other people around me started to care about the climate change and talk about carbon neutrality after reading my novel. And yes, this change was made just through one novel. Since then, I've learned the way to deliver information is really important when you try to raise people's awareness on certain issues. Currently in Korea, the government and various organizations are making lots of efforts to raise public awareness on the climate change. But still, their language with technical terms and complicated data is too difficult to understand for young people. In addition, most Korean youth are super busy taking care of their everyday lives in school or at work. In other words, they don't have enough time and effort to put much effort in understanding climate change issues, except if there is a special trigger like the Nobel contest. So we, young green leaders, are trying to find a way to deliver relevant information regarding climate change issues in a more interesting, accessible, and understandable manner to the public. We try to address the climate change in plain language from the perspective of the youth and link it to people's interests. To do this, we should have accurate understanding of the climate change. We need to get professional trainings that can broaden our knowledge, foster our leadership, and suggest what actions we should take to tackle the climate crisis. Then we should act to raise public awareness. For example, my team conducted surveys to understand people's perspective towards climate change issues, and we explored suitable ways to spread our findings from the survey. Now we need to have a deep discussion on climate change issues such as energy transition, climate justice, and carbon neutrality in our daily lives. To make fruitful debates with more people, we also can use creative ways like art and literature. Videos and cartoons or even emojis on social media are accessible contents to spread the difficult or technical issues widely. Korean people often feel that there is a distinct distance among different generations. However, as we know, the climate change matters for all. Therefore, we should try to communicate with other generations about the climate change. To have a conversation not only with my colleagues but also with other generations, I participated in designing a culture event which is called Talk Carbon Neutrality. With young and old generations from various backgrounds shared their opinions and thoughts about the climate change on this event. At the same time, we also need to communicate to the younger generation why climate change is important and how we can deal with it.
Let me introduce my story. I am a climate educator in Yuseibos. I teach children about climate change. Pictures of polar bears are commonly used in climate change education. Polar bears have been used for their education in such a way that climate change melts Arctic glaciers and eliminates polar bears' habitat. In particular, Korean education deals with the story of polar bears whenever it mentions climate change in elementary, secondary, and higher school curriculums from the 1990s to the present day. I was a child who fell in love with this polar bear story. While studying climate change alone with books and documentaries, I knew that it was a matter of justice and was angry at the schools of climate change education that only taught me polar bears. So, when I became an adult, I wanted to exactly explain to children what climate change is and why it is a problem and what to do to prevent it. By conducting climate change education for younger generations, I realized two important things. First, the role of young generation, especially for most 20s, are crucial. As the preceding generation of the future, we should be responsible for the climate crisis. Second, climate change education should broaden the understanding towards different perspectives. We live in an era where interests and conflicts among different generations and groups of climate change are sharply opposed. Climate change education is essential to mitigate these social conflicts and find alternatives for everyone together. As an educator, I found the following 4 directions about climate change education for future generations. First, climate change education should be realistic. It should be based on the latest and formal facts, as in the IPCC report. Second, it has to be practical. The climate action methods covered in education should be on a scale that children can practice in their daily lives. Third, it has to be creative. The education should be linked to children's future ideas and careers to cope with the climate change. Lastly, the tone of this education should be less fearful, but positive. In summary, climate change education for future generations must convey exact reality and the possibility of hope at the same time. However, public climate change education in Korea is insufficient. In addition, it was difficult for Korean teenagers to participate in school strike for climate that spread around the world in 2019. It was difficult for future generations to participate in strike because participation in it was not recognized as a reason for the absence. For the reason, there was a record-breaking study time for Korean teenagers, but there was an atmosphere of the older generations that did not accept their suffrage even though teenagers had the right to vote. However, even in these difficult situations, future generations in Korea are moving for the climate. For example, the civic group called Youth for Climate filed a constitutional complaint against the government last year. They pointed out the government's passive response to climate crisis. In addition, many teenagers are speaking out about climate change through the media and various environmental events and conferences. This proved that climate change education is a strong demand from future generations. Lastly, let me tell you what I heard from a 10-year-old boy I met in June this year in a climate change education classroom. To adults, climate change may not seem serious now, but it could be a big disaster later. So please pay attention to it for us, for future generations.
As the world is aware of the seriousness of climate change more and more, global climate change initiatives also have increased noticeably around the world's common purpose to limit global temperature up to 1.5 degrees Celsius in the last 1 to 2 years. So the various stakeholders are connecting to these several climate initiatives to speed up climate action. In this wave, we, Korean young generation, also recognizes climate change as the most important issue and actively supports climate initiatives. Here, let me introduce myself. My name is Yewon Kim, and I'm a climate actor, starting with interest in UN MDGs and SDGs. The first reason I became interested in these international affairs was to go on a mission trip to 3 Middle Eastern countries. After facing civil wars, disputes, violating of the child and refugee issues there, I became more interested in international issues centered on UN MDGs. Against this background, I was particularly interested in climate policy and global climate initiatives and studied some practical climate action. Currently, now I'm belonging to as an opinion leader team for Yuseibers, which is supporters of Climate Change Center in Korea. Not only myself, but also many Korean young generation are interested in several climate initiatives and suggest some feedback on the Korean climate policies. Through this, we are making various efforts from domestic to international aspects in order to raise awareness of climate change among young people and many others. First of all, at the domestic level, our Korean young people are trying to communicate with various stakeholders and participating in various joint discussions and meetings. In other words, we play the role as so-called young politicians. For example, in Korea, Yuseibers and the groups for climate action including GEYK and U-Ways have been supporting climate initiatives and freely expressing their opinions on climate policies. At the international level, we, Korean young generation, informs the world the efforts of young Koreans on climate change and gives some good influence to it. For example, Tripartite Environment Ministers Meeting Youth Forum called TEMM in Ministry of Environment is typical youth forum on climate change that I also belong to. This can inform the awareness and efforts of Korean young people on climate change to young representatives in Japan and China. Also, it can strengthen trilateral bonding and cooperation among young people in 3 countries. Furthermore, it can help Generation M in the world to have and develop their own responsibility for climate action. Like those above, I think there should be various climate actions and activities that young people can do, centering on the climate initiatives, which will be newer in the future. Above all, I would like to conclude my remarks by emphasizing the importance of young generation to raise awareness of the importance of cooperation at the regional and global levels.
There's a lot of people out there who do not know the importance of climate change mitigation and what we'll need to change for this. The climate change mitigation is not a choice, it is something we must do, not just for the youth, but for the future of all of us. So please pay more attention to the voice of young people on climate change issues and make it heard by your friends, family members, colleagues, whoever you love. Just raising your awareness can change our future.
For education, qualified climate change educators are immediately needed, so that is school curriculum. The Ministry of Education and Environment must cooperate to respond to this demand. Don't explain climate change with polar bears and separate discharges anymore, but tell us what is really happening because of climate change and tell us what we, future generations, can do to prevent this climate crisis.
For political aspect, we would like to ask all the young people to actively play the role for carbon neutrality as future generation. Also, please cooperate with young people in the world. To older generation, we would like to ask you guys to take action in establishing and implementing policies in consideration of environmental factors in all fields for just transition and climate justice. Additionally, please strengthen global environmental governance between each country to actively act on climate change.
Please watch with us.
Please join us and have your voice.
Please act with us. We,
Young generation will create a sustainable future with all generations and all races on the planet.